Two, one. All right. And all right. We're on Periscope on Eric's. We are on YouTube. We're all a little crazy, and we're on Facebook. All right. Have at it, Eric. Three, two, one.
Great. Well, I wanted to welcome everyone. These are an important set of conversations we're going to be having, not only today, but ongoing. My name is Eric Hewson. I'm the founder of an organization called the Same Here Global Mental Health Movement, Same Here being an American Sign Language sign. The genesis of that is background being we're all the same when it comes to the topic of mental health, meaning we all face challenges. Those challenges are things like loss of loved ones, sickness of loved ones, divorce, breakups. We all go through difficult times in our lives. And so instead of looking at this larger topic of mental health as one where it's two buckets, the mentally ill group and then everyone else who's in the healthier group, we like to look at it as a society, if we're facing challenges, let's focus on our commonalities and what brings us together. And that 5 and 5 are part of that same group where we're all fluctuating on the mental health continuum, as opposed to the 1 and 5 that we hear about so often. And so with that as a background, as so much has happened from a current event standpoint in our country and our world recently related to social justice, and the 5 of us who are on the call right now, but a much larger network even beyond that, started talking and having conversations. What's difficult and hurtful for us to see is to look at the division that we see in our country and our world. And no, social justice is not the same issue exactly as mental health, but the same factors we believe apply in that there's a lot more commonality, a lot more that binds us together than there are things that separate us. And so because of that, when we've spoken beforehand, we've taken a look at things like how we communicate with one another based on much of what's happened with current events, some of what we've seen in terms of very sensitive footage and images, and then how it plays to what's been going on for centuries in our country and in our world. And the sad thing, I think, for all of us coming into this call is that we see different vantage points, different angles, even different sides, as controversial as it might say to call it that, where the communication is happening primarily in a number of different ways. It's through people sharing limited characters through social media and sharing a very strong opinion that often comes from the wrong angle, that is misinterpreted, that's difficult to understand with one another. It's happening through the traditional media where we're seeing images and news stories on CNN, we're seeing images and news stories on Fox, or you pick the newspaper and sides are being taken. And so politics is being brought into it. And it's happening even at the events, at the demonstrations, at the protests that we're seeing, where we have groups of people who are shouting at one another. And so the reason for coming together like this and creating a Hear Us Out platform is because there's so much to the nuance of what goes into the marketing messages that are out there, the campaigns that are out there, the lived experiences that we've all been through, that it's important to bring together a diverse group of people to talk about, not even only from our own personal standpoints, but the standpoints of our friends and our family members and what we're hearing from them. And then to be able to discuss those openly with a group of people who actually are willing to listen to different perspectives and to not shout over one another, and to be able to share and actually collaborate. And a little bit of the work that we did as we were preparing for this, although it'd be very little amount of work because we really wanted this to be organic, is to think about what are things that we can take from this that are next steps or actionable to really help move the conversation forward. And so I'm going to give a quick introduction to everyone, and then they can introduce themselves a little bit further. But first gentleman that I met on this group is Don Povia, who is the president of a organization called Transition Sports and Entertainment and the Outside Game, and he works with a number of professional athletes, very much from a marketing standpoint in terms of helping them with their brands. Someone who was on his team, a gentleman by the name of Vic Nwere, had a little bit of time in the NFL, played big-time football with Cal before that, and again is in that similar space to Don, working with professional athletes, helping them with their brands. Got Nicole Thompson, who is a school psychologist in the Philadelphia area. She goes under the name GOAT Educator, so greatest of all time. And I've just been such a big fan of her work and some of the traumatic experiences personally she's been through in her life and how she then helps students, teachers, and professionals to better understand some of the challenges that we all face. And then a good buddy who I was introduced to through the NBA player Derek Anderson, a gentleman by the name of Jason Atkins, who runs the Edge Sports Therapy. So is a therapist for a number of different athletes on the pro level, athletes in the youth sports level, and then just everyday people in general. And so if you guys don't mind just going a little bit more into your backgrounds, Don, we can start with you and just kind of go down the list. Don, Vic, Nicole, and Jason, give a little more background on each of you and how you came to this conversation.
Sure, I was going to say, how deep do you want us to go? But we won't go too bad.
30 seconds each just to give a little more color than I did.
Sure. Guy from Trenton, New Jersey, married. I have 3 daughters. Been working in sports probably a little over a decade. Had worked in politics prior to that. So Eric was teasing my gray, distinguished hair earlier. But yeah, I got up there and been around. And really, when we started Transition, it was co-founded by former NFL player Keith Bullock, who came up with the name, and really he and I fleshed out the concept of, very literally, how do we help guys transition post-career? How do we leverage the 3, 7, 10 years that they might have in the league and not having them start from scratch when their career ends? How do we take advantage of those years and build, not just on the field, but off the field? I'm wearing a nonprofit, wrong breast. One of the nonprofits that I'm on the board of, which is a former captain at the University of Houston. So, doing a little bit of everything. I was fortunate in those travels to meet guys like Vic, and, when our philosophies coincide, it's always great when we can come together and really try to, come at this together from different perspectives, generationally, racially, demographically, geographically, and really put all those pieces together and form something special. So happy to have guys like him on board, and especially having him join us today as well.
Yeah. So as Don mentioned, former college football player, and first and foremost, I hail from Southwest Houston, Texas, so everyone knows that. And as a former athlete, as a former college student, where I studied legal studies at UC Berkeley. First and foremost, those things are characteristics of me. I am African American. I'm most importantly Black first. And so my perspective, man, and what I do a lot is help with these young athletes and give them opportunities to, when they're done playing and a lot of people stop caring about them, to be there and show them how to build a second life, how to push forward, right? How to transition, no pun intended. And so 2 great introductions, and it really leave me with much to say, but that's a little bit of background on me.
And a little bit background on me, I served as a school psychologist in a large urban high school for several years, and I noticed a lot of trauma during that time. Just to rewind before that, like Eric touched on, I did suffer a lot of adverse experiences in my childhood with a clinically depressed mom that ultimately led to her committing suicide and me waking up next to her dead body. So with all of those experiences and experiences that I had in the school and seeing the inequities that were there and the trauma, that's when I decided to leave as an acting school psychologist and start GOAT Educators, so I can teach, those urban teachers how to approach the students that have trauma and heal those students with love. So that's why I'm here to speak about the inequities.
All right. Well, I'm very glad to be here. Jason Atkins, as Eric mentioned, former pro athlete turned licensed psychotherapist. And I live in the Atlanta area, although I'm born and raised in Chicago. And I've had the pleasure and the gift of being able to travel all around the world through basketball, whether it's been to Central America or Eastern Europe or Western Europe and various spots in between. And have really had an amazing journey to encounter a lot of people and a lot of different experiences. And as a healthcare professional, as someone who is, committed to helping individuals, but with athletes as well as the community, to really embrace the 5 and 5 approach and recognition that all of us have something that we struggle with. This subject, this issue, this topic that has now emerged and exploded and has infiltrated politics, sports, religion, communities, families, marital relationships, parent-child. Every single one of us is now impacted. Every single group is somehow touched by what's going on right now. And this is a critical time for us to then be having this kind of conversation so that we can hear each other.
And I thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for introducing yourself. But it tees up, what we're going to be talking about. And I'm glad we got all the introductions out in the first quarter hour here. But you look at the background. I look across the top of the screen: Chicago, Philadelphia, Houston, onto California, right? New Jersey, New York. We got a lot of different representation in terms of different backgrounds geographically. A lot of different backgrounds just socially. The interesting thing is we come at this from so many different angles. And so what I wanted to start with, and I thought would be a really interesting question for us to dive into, is we know from a current event standpoint, unless you don't have a computer, you don't have a phone, you don't have a TV, you've seen, unfortunately, some pretty difficult scenes play out in front of you. Start with the George Floyd thing in and of itself, and then connect it to so many other situations that we've watched that have come before it and even after it, if we're going to be completely transparent and honest about it. But Ahmaud Arbery, going back to Breonna, it's a long list. And so my question for everyone is, when you think about all the different places that we talk about that we grew up, you think about the schooling that you've gotten and the education you've gotten as it's related to social topics in our society. What you learned in school, what you learned from your parents, what you learned from your friends. If you had to take a stab, and it's okay, like, again, these are going to be some sensitive topics. If you looked at it and you looked at a group of white people, you looked at a group of black people, and you said, what do we think people are thinking about current events right now? Is the focus on what we've seen in the media right now? And do most people have their focus on what has taken place in front of us in a vacuum primarily? Or do you think most people look at what has happened right now over the last couple of weeks in a very public way, but how it sits on a context of 400 plus years and more, Nicole will get into, of real history in our country and our world that plays into what's happened more recently? And I think us each answering that question in terms of the vantage point of our education, being around our parents, our family, our friends, we're each going to have a very, very different angle in terms of how we answer that question. So maybe I'll throw it to Vic to start off.
Yeah, so I would say, just want to give everyone a background about my experience growing up. And so, like I said, I grew up in Southwest Houston, Texas. Growing up, I went to a school district in Stafford, and I ended up going all the way through elementary, middle school, all that to Stafford High School. And people don't know this in the South, and in Houston in particular, majority of schools are still somewhat demographically segregated. And so at Stafford, I grew up in a school where about 95% of the individuals at the school were African American, right? And so in that self, it breeded a bubble. And I think back now, even the 3 individuals we had in the school that were white or of any other descent, right? They were only at our school because they had parents who worked in the school district. And so going into high school, I was at Stafford for 1 year as a freshman. Then I transferred to Austin High School on the other side of town, which is a predominantly white high school, right? And so at a very young age, for the first time, I experienced a culture shock of two completely different environments, right? Seeing the resources, the friends, and the environment at one school, and now seeing it on the complete flip side. And so from just a young standpoint, an educational standpoint, it was very clear to see how different the worlds were, right? The resources that were allotted to individuals over here versus the resources that were allotted to individuals over here, right? And so one of the toughest things that I experienced is that when I first got to the school, if we're being completely transparent, I didn't have a lot of friends, right? A lot of people didn't really want to speak to me. I dressed different. I looked different. I had a big kind of flat top haircut, and I just came from a different place than they did, right? And one of the things that to this day, I still deal with, we're talking about mental health, is I had a lot of individuals who didn't really want to talk to me, be around me, and then, come around junior year, football and sports starts to take off with me. And I would kind of get individuals in the school who would want to be friends with me or want to hang out with me. And they would say things like, we would love for you to come to this party or come to this, just don't bring, your group of friends. Because obviously I hung out with majority of the Africans and Black individuals at the school. They started to look at me and my Blackness as a characteristic. And people would say things like, you're one of us, you're not one of them. Like, you're not Black, you're one of us. And they looked at the traits of success and not having success, quote unquote, as a white characteristic, in a sense, a white and Black characteristic. And so at a very young age, I was dealing with some of these very, very, very real things and unpacking them, understanding that a lot of individuals and people do it today wanted to hang out with me, not because of who I was, but because what I could do for them, or if I was a star football player at the school, right? All of a sudden they looked at me as the success I achieved, although being the same person, same mind, same name, same face, they looked at me as he can now be in this group, right? This elite group or whatever it was back then, because he has success, right? And so with that, growing up and leaving Houston and going to Berkeley, which is completely different than Houston, Texas, anyone knows, right? One of the biggest, most liberal schools. I was able to kind of unpack my experience as a young adult and see that what was really behind that, right? The implicit biases that live behind those thoughts and words that individuals that were very young and very naive were saying to me. And so that let me know at a very young age that just something wasn't right, and it was just, it's even tough to talk about today, but, I started to really, really realize that people really attributed me, they would look at me as an African-American and they would say, hey, like, you have to prove to me that you're not this person, that you're not a thug, that you're not an X, Y, and Z, right? That you're not someone who's a threat, right? I did so many things and so many, things in school that I'm like, all these things were like stamps to say that I'm worthy of a conversation, right? And so a lot of African-Americans feel that and believe, and it's the truth, that we start at a negative, right? With a lot of the individuals and relationships that I had, it's like nobody wanted to be my sophomore year when I didn't play and I wrote the bench. Nobody wanted to be my friend. Nobody wanted me to come to parties. Junior year, I get all these offers, things blow up, and it's like, hey, we want you to come, but they only wanted me there. They didn't want any of my other Black friends there. They didn't want anybody who's really close to me there. They just wanted me there, right? Even the parents. Like, I went to graduations as a senior in high school, some of my colleagues and friends, and I was the only Black individual from our school they invited to come, right? And the parents, too, would be like, hey, so that's just a little bit of a background of me and just kind of how, even at the school level at such a young age, you can see race truly be performative and it start to build in that sense.
So, and I'm going to hold your feet to the fire, Vic, because I'm going to ask everyone this question. So that background is so helpful in terms of us understanding growing up as a kid and then growing up and even seeing some different things happening in college and your eyes being a little bit wider and discovering those things. And again, we're going to talk about sensitive topics. So when you look at majority white community, majority Black community, and you hear about what's going on with the current events today, my guess would be when you look at the Black community based on your own experience, that what's being looked at with what's playing out in front of us is being looked at in the context of, and make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth, of a long history of things. And this is just now a major piece that's coming into focus. How would you, one, is that correct? Two, from what you know from your white friends and what you've heard from your white friends, how are they looking at current events wise, what's happening relative to the past, or are they looking at just in the prism of, hey, this is really bad that this is going on right now with the individuals that have been killed?
Yeah, so to punctuate what you're saying, the experience and the context that you're speaking of is very real, right? I don't even look at the context of the perspective. The context is the context, right? People engage with that reality in a different sense. Humans, as we are born innately ignorant. And what I mean by that is a lot of other species, they're born with a setup. They know how to feed themselves. You know, if you look at a dog within 2 or 3 months, they know where to go to the bathroom, where not to go to the bathroom. So everything as the human race is 100% passed down, right? Everything is very intentional, right? With the upbringing of our own children and things of that nature. So when we have that conversation, what's happening now, the only thing that's different is their cameras, right? So it's not that George Floyd's death was an outlier. George Floyd's death, and it sucks to say, is the consistency. It's constant. It's been constant for 400 years, right? What's happening now is that the other side, because of what's going on, is being forced to take a deep look at themselves and look inside and really address it. This has been going on for a long time. But just like the educational system and what systems are, if you look at the definition of a system, right? A system is to keep something cyclical, to keep something going. So how could you expect that the system that was created 400, 300 years ago wasn't designed to keep the social hierarchy the way it is? And it's ignorant to think that a system, by definition, wasn't designed to keep society cyclical, right? And keep the same things occurring over and over. So the difference is that now we're in an age where everyone's able to see it, right? A lot of people for a lot of time, and the media is infamous for this, would mask certain things or put out the certain things out there they want you to know. Just look at education. The things that they teach us, you know, there's so many things that, you know, why is it that all of us have different backgrounds, right? All of us do different things. We have different jobs. Why is it that from the age of 0 to 18, if all humans are really born inherently ignorant, we're all taught the exact same things in school systems, right? Because they want to keep it this base level. They want to be able to control people. They want people to understand and only know what they want them to know. So to answer your question, it is, you know, the context is the reality. I think everyone on that side, whatever race, is looking at it through their own perspective. And what we're asking for a lot of people to do is that you have to shed your implicit bias and you have to take the opportunity to research and teach yourself and really listen to your Black friends, your Black family, even your Black significant other, right? And hear their voice, because the truth of the matter is you won't be able to understand until you really hear what's really going on.
So as I pivot the question over to Nicole, what I'm taking from that answer, in paraphrasing it, Vic, is that with the implicit bias there, they might not realize it. They're looking at the Floyd case and using a very specific situation, and they're seeing it as this is a pivotal moment, this is a major thing that happened, but they're not necessarily seeing it as much in the context of 400 plus years of other systematic things going on. They're looking at it more poignantly in this moment. Wow, the house is on fire, right? Yeah. And so, Nicole, how would you again, you shared a little bit of background, you shared traumatic experience with growing up, what happened with your mom, but you also live in a very different city. You grew up in a different way than the way that Vic just described. You know, how do you see that this has played out over the last month? And how would you look at it as how the Black community views it, how the white community views it?
So unfortunately, the Black community just views it as, like Vic was saying, this is an ongoing saga that has been going on since we were forced here, enslaved in this country. And what a lot of people don't realize is even with the 13th Amendment, after the slaves were so-called free, it was a clause in that amendment that allowed mass incarceration and pushed us into chain gangs. And even it was bringing it back to the police. So the police always had their hands in oppressing Black people. There were vagrancy laws where if you caught a Black person that, we were so-called free from slavery, But if a black person, a black man in particular, was just out on the streets, a cop could come arrest them and put them in prison, and they'll go into the chain gang. And that has been happening ever since then. The mass incarceration rates now are very disproportionate. And unfortunately, it's that way because the big companies capitalize off of it. Two of the huge prison systems in this country, which is GEO, and I can't remember the other one, they're on the stock market. So locking up black bodies, they get paid for that. And you have to look at all of the companies, the huge companies, like Dell, which I found out just recently, Boeing. There's so many big companies that invest in prisoners and get paid off of cheap labor. So it's like, why would the systems stop oppressing us when they're benefiting off of our labor, which they have been since we came here? And it's just a system of oppression across the board, especially in the education system, because you know that education is power and education is freedom. And if they could keep that information away from us, they'll keep us divided and exactly black people oppressed exactly the way that they want us to be. So in history, you'll know that most of the focus is on white history. You don't see too much representation of black people or any other people for that matter. We have those little 28 days and we're constantly taught about the same people. We're constantly taught about slavery. We're never educated about how Africans were rich and independent and resourceful before we came to this country. Like we mentioned earlier when we were talking offline, we know about slavery. We know about the lynchings. We know about Martin Luther King, so on and so forth. And then from there, everything was wonderful. But what we don't know is all of the systems of oppression that were used and are still being used right now to keep us oppressed. 85% of the lynchings back in the day when they were happening was happening on successful black people. Whenever they were getting ahead, the white people would come and lynch them. And it's no different now. We saw it in the Tulsa riots when they burnt down all of Tulsa and killed so many black people. It was a massacre. And unfortunately, those are ways where every time we try to take a step forward, they knock us down and bring us back 5 steps back. Even going to in the 80s when I was a kid and crack hit. Crack was systematically placed in our neighborhoods to continue to tear up our families and imprison our black men so they can keep us dependent on government assistance and things of that sort. And even when I was in elementary school, my first elementary school that I went to, it was so underpoor and under-resourced that we didn't even have a cafeteria. We would bring in placemats and eat lunch at our desk. Our textbooks, we didn't have enough textbooks. We had to share textbooks, and the textbooks were so old. The front covers were ripped off. There were pages ripped out. We could never take the materials home. And, you know, it was just those inequities that I saw, because then later, when I actually worked in a suburban district, of course, it was nothing like that. They had a large pool, a large campus, and so many other different things I've never seen. And I've never would have seen hadn't I worked in that district.
And so, you know, that background's amazing. What Vic and Nicole, what you just shared, kind of leads me to the question that I would ask Jason, which is, you know, all those things that have been brought up that are things that I don't necessarily know if you ask the average white person to be able to fill in the gaps on all those either statistics or events that have happened over the course of history, 400 years, and then Nicole, even, you know, prior to 400 years. How much of that is what's taught specifically in the Black community? How much of the knowledge that you have is what's taught in schools you've been in, your own personal experiences? How much of it is passed down family in terms of what your families taught you, grandparents, parents, right? Because, you know, what's starting to take shape here as you're both talking, and Don and I are going to give our experiences in terms of what our educational backgrounds were and what we learned, is growing up with family members who are Black, who had obviously older family members from earlier generations. And then you go back those generations, it's not that far back to going back to 1865. If you look at it, it's only been 160 years since slavery was abolished, not even that much. And so now as I go to Jason, and I want you to fill in the blanks, please, on your own personal experience, but how much of it is what you learned because it's what you learned in school? How much was it what you learned being around your friends? How much of it is your own research and studying it and figuring it out for yourself? How much of it is what your parents taught you?
Well, thank you, Eric. What I'll say is this. For me, I grew up in Chicago, and people who are from Chicago know that when you say in Chicago, it's different than if you mean like in the suburbs versus in the city. It just has a different bottom line there. And I am from the city. I'm from the South Side. I'm from an area they call the Wild Hundreds. And educationally, I was actually pretty lucky to attend as a child what's called a classical school, which is a school that actually goes. Every student in the school works 2 years ahead of their grade for having some sort of intellectual gift. And I did the same thing for high school. Went to Whitney Young High School, same school as Michelle Obama. And Michael Jordan's kids later in life went to Whitney Young as well. What I can tell you is this. We learned, I think, the same kind of standards that the cities and the state, public education and federal Department of Education set as far as what the expectations are. This is what slavery was. This is what the experience has been. And in my family, we haven't even touched the conversation that I've observed as this whole kind of racial dialogue and has evolved. We haven't even touched on variances amongst African Americans, right? We haven't even touched on light skin versus dark skin and how that, within our own, context, how that plays out. But I can tell you that that for me played a big role in my growing up personally. Being a very light skinned African American male, I was definitely looked at differently, treated differently, and by different in some regards, more favorable, given more benefits, more advantages, more leeway, and then in other terms, being totally rejected and feeling ostracized by my own people who said, "Oh, you think you're better than us, and what's wrong with you?" And it was, "You're not us, you're one of them," and all of that. So there was certainly that experience growing up, but beyond that, I would say that to answer your question, Eric, I did take a very personal approach to really doing my own homework and digging in and beginning to understand not only my own personal background, but what our people's experience has been. And there's something there's a couple things I really want to share. I'm not sure when it's the right time to open up this part of it. There's a couple of pieces I'd like to do like a screen share and really talk about because I think that they really, as we talk about this whole conversation and where we're all going with this, to me, I'm always about evolution, not revolution. I think that evolution, the difference between the two is revolution is you revolve. You start, you go, and you come back to where you started. And I don't want to come back to where we started. I don't think that's healthy for anybody right now. I think evolution is you go, you come back, but when you come back, you've grown to a different level. And when you come back, you've been changed by the circumstance and you reach another level. So evolution for me is critical. And there's a couple of pieces that help us all evolve. And this is the beginning of it, I'll say that. And also, Don, check the chat, please.
Yeah, I
So as Don's checking the chat,
I emailed it to you. I think I saw what you saw, but I don't want to mess with the stream too much, so I'm trying not to do that. But check your email.
All right.
So Jason, what I took away from you is obviously a lot of your own personal, individual research, and then the other main takeaway again being within the Black community, some of the rifts, if you will, some of the sides, some of the placing people in different buckets that goes on, that goes away from this same here concept, right? Like, we're all part of the same group. How do we grow together? And I know that's idealistic, and I know that's utopian, and we're going to get to that. But those backgrounds are so helpful. I think, Don, you and I need to be very transparent and honest about this, right? Like, you and I grew up playing sports. You and I grew up being teammates with white kids, with black kids, with every other type of ethnicity that's out there. When you grow up in a team sport environment, your teammates are your teammates, right? They're your brothers. That's who you're going to war with. But that being said, I think there's some pretty interesting things about the education system that we got, what was left out, what was put in, and what puts us at an advantage or a disadvantage in terms of understanding this larger picture of what's going on right now in society. So I'd love to hear your take on it, and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, I'll touch on the sports because you mentioned it, but I think it's almost kind of where Vic was. I mean, when I was 5 years old, I wasn't going to war with guys. I was just having fun. And they were my friends before they were my teammates. And by they, I mean my teammates. It didn't matter, what color you were. So my neighborhood growing up was pretty unique. As I mentioned, Trenton, New Jersey, it's called the Chambersburg section. Right now, it's mostly Hispanic, Guatemalan, Italian more, again, 30 years ago when I was younger, Puerto Rican. Behind me was mostly African American. If anybody knows where the Trenton train station is, I'm about 2 blocks from there. Not the best place to be, crime-wise. But I went to Catholic school, 1st grade through 8th grade, and I think more the focus was less on social studies and history, more on reading, writing, arithmetic. So I don't remember getting a real baseline for history, I guess 1st through 8th grade. It was probably as Nicole described it. You check off your boxes, the same thing that you do. You do a nice little Black History Month project and kind of move on. But, more than anything, I think this small, again, I had about 16 people in my 8th grade class. Wasn't resource-wise, older books. I don't think we had a library. It was somebody's house down the street that we could go look at books, literally. But I did play sports. I started playing baseball at 5, football at 6, basketball around 6 as well. So I played 3 sports kind of growing up with people of all races. And again, I think to its credit now, looking back, even having this conversation, I think that my schooling and, I went to public high school, but I think what they taught me being a good person, I don't think I ever gave them as much credit as they probably deserved being the school, which isn't even there anymore, which tells you about the financial situation that it was going through. It doesn't exist. In high school, I moved. I didn't really know anybody, similar to Vic, but it was, I think it was one of the more diverse schools in New Jersey when I was there. I remember a study coming out, and it still is. So again, I was playing football. I was on campus before anybody else was, and I was making friends with my teammates going to war. But again, friends first. I liked what Jason said about sort of doing his own homework and self-education. I'm actually, not a dual major, but interdisciplinary major in history and political science. And when I had the opportunity to take the electives in the history side, I took everything from Russian history 1 and 2 to 2 different semesters of Islam in Africa, and really took it upon myself to educate myself beyond what you probably learned in high school, which again was probably pretty stereotypical. So I kind of embraced it. It's funny. I really am kind of amused right now, just looking back, that I think I was lucky that my parents and my schooling just raised me to be colorblind. I was talking before, that doesn't mean I don't recognize the struggles that others go to, but I think on a personal level, the personal relationships that I've had, I don't think it's ever been affected too well. And hopefully, if it has, interracial relationships that I've had, hopefully it's been more on the positive side than the negative side. So yeah, unique educational, small Catholic city, suburbs for high school, but still pretty diverse. And then college, studying history. And, I mentioned earlier too, just, a lot of Native American reading that I did, you know, uh, which also kind of opened my eyes to the plight of different people in this country and the literal whitewashing that we get in the education system. And I think a lot of that needs to be talked about. But these issues kind of run deep, and everyone is affected by it in some way or another.
And
maybe I overuse the cliche, going to war with, because it's something that
once you get to high school and college,
Yeah,
you're more at war, but kind of playing in the schoolyard, it's yeah.
But okay, I'll tell you why I use that term, because I'll give you my experience now. Like, I grew up in a predominantly white town that was neighboring predominantly black town, Freeport, Long Island, which has produced some pretty awesome entertainers, athletes. And we had this town park that was in our town, and folks from Freeport came in, folks from my town came in, and we mixed, and we would check the ball in, and it didn't matter whose team you were on; those are your teammates for that. And you did go to war, even though you were 12, 13 years old at the time. That's how you mix. That's how you interact with folks. But I'll tell you, from the standpoint of growing up in a predominantly white school, and again, I think Jason said it very well, very eloquently, in terms of like what federal standards there are and things like that. So it's like, okay, where does this stuff get passed down from? Whether you grow up in a predominantly white community, predominantly black community, what are we taught in school? Here are the things that stick out in my mind in terms of what those little benchmarks were that we learned during Black History Month, right? We learned about, to Nicole's point, we learned about slavery, but we didn't learn what happened before slavery. So a big piece of what Black people were doing living in Africa before slavery is left out completely, right? Then it's like slavery happens, and then all of a sudden we learn about the abolition of slavery, how great of a president Abraham Lincoln was, that the Civil War happened, and that now all of a sudden slavery is over and the 13th Amendment happened. They didn't gloss over it to the point to say everything's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and perfect right now and rainbows and butterflies. But then it was like, okay, there were things like separate but equal. We heard that term. And then it was fast forward, we heard about the 1900s, the middle 1900s, and it was Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. And it's like, okay, bing, bang, done. Those injustices that were taking place right there, we had people step up and do peaceful protests and give the I Have a Dream speech, and now things are better, right? And if that's the context that a lot of us are coming from on this, you could understand, and I'm not justifying anything, I'm more saying you can understand why there's this gap and there's this misunderstanding. And maybe not everyone does as much education as self-educating as what Jason described. But doing my own education, you start to go back and you look at things like, what were the Jim Crow laws, right? And how were they used after Plessy versus Ferguson, where, it was determined that you can have separate facilities. And now it became, we're going to have separate schools. We're going to have separate, bathrooms. We're going to have separate cars on trains, right? And that became the norm, okay? To have things completely separate. And then you go into the 1930s with FDR. I don't in school remember learning about redlining and greenlining and creating areas where predominantly Black families would live, and then it became almost impossible if you lived in that red line area to be able to get a loan. 95% of the loans were going to the green line areas, only 5% of the loans. So even if the American dream and you had a big idea and you're going for a loan, you almost had no chance of getting that loan just based on where the government decided your neighborhood was circled around and where you were put in that place. And so when we hear terms like systematic racism, right, or how the system oppresses or holds back a certain group of people, I think it's important for us to really go back and to understand specifically the things that have gone on in our history and separate that out from, I think, we speak with these terms and we hear systematic racism, we see the terms right now. The reason why I asked that question about how does it interplay with what's currently going on versus what's gone on for 400 plus years is that when you hear systematic, some people might immediately go to cops, police officers. That's the system. Okay, that's how some people view it, and that's a piece of a system. And there's pieces within the system, you know, that I think there would be agreement that we want to see change on. But there's such a bigger system in place here that we really want to be able to dive into so that there's a greater understanding amongst everyone when we talk about systematically there being less of a chance for Black people to be able to have success, Black people to be able to break out of certain situations. It comes from this history of where our country's been and the decisions that we've made. And by the way, I'm not being softball here. I think we're going to get into some like harder questions at the beginning, but I want to at least begin to lay the foundation because these are important talks. You know, the next thing I want to go into, because we and Jason, I know you got a bunch of things to add to this. Like, the next thing I want to go into is what's very difficult between Black people and white people right now is when we were doing the prep calls, I was kind of talking about it, how if we were all friends and we had a friend whose family member passed away, we'd all be kind of tiptoeing around it, being like, what do you say to your friend when their family member passed away? Do you say, I'm sorry? Is I'm sorry not enough? Do you give a cliche answer? I'm really sorry. My thoughts and prayers are with you. Or do they say, oh, that's a bullshit way to respond. That's just too cliche. You can't give me a more genuine answer than that. Or do you shut your mouth and not say anything at all, but then you're at the risk of the person who has a family member pass away saying, my friend's an asshole. They didn't even say anything to me, right? And so maybe start with Jason, just because I saw you about to chime in there, is, you know, can we talk a little bit about being a Black man, what is uncomfortable right now to talk with your white friends about, to share on social media? And we'll go back and forth here. I think that's fine. I think there's a level of discomfort where we're afraid of saying things because we're afraid we're going to offend people and we're not going to move the conversation in the right direction.
So a couple things I want to make sure I touch on, but just because they'll go out of my mind and the conversation will go in different directions. One is when you mentioned the part of Long Island, I think you said Freeport.
Freeport, yeah.
You know, you mentioned that there's been a lot of entertainers and athletes that came out of it. We are way more than that.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm not saying it to you, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that as a representation, right? Because Eric, you and I know, you and I have been, you know, we've been brothers from day one, and we'll continue to be. But there's a representation kind of thing that I just want to make sure that we are inclusive of the whole diaspora of who our people are and what we do and our contributions and what makes us, you know, important and relevant and matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start there. Another thing is when we talk
in
about
fairness, is because Eddie Murphy is from that town, so like that's a pretty big entertainment name to be coming out. So that was the reason. But yes.
Well, here's the other thing, right? Eric could be afraid to say something because it could be misconstrued and taken the wrong way, despite what he actually do.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And I am an athlete, and I'm literally saying, don't just coin us as entertainers and athletes. So, you know what I'm saying? So trust me, I get it. I'm not, you know, trying to get on top of everybody and complain. I'm just simply saying that that when we talk about, and this is the perfect segue into what I want to do a quick screen share on. There's something that I think a lot of people fail to really understand when they say what they want, right? They say, oh, we want equality. We just want equality. We want equal treatment. We want equality, right? This, you know, drawing here, I think effectively really points out, really when you're asking for equality, if this is what you want, this is what you get. And what you end up doing is helping people who didn't need help. If you just did the same to everybody, right? And truly what's better than equality, what's more effective than equality is equity. When we give equity equitable distribution of resources to people who need more get more. And for those who don't need help, why are we helping them if they already have, they don't need any assistance? See on the third slide here, where it talks about justice, the cause of the inequity was addressed. The barrier itself, right? Let's do what we can to make it where we don't have to necessarily build individual people up. What if we remove the obstacle to begin with? And so when we do that, that is, I think, a really effective way to kind of illustrate and demonstrate. Eric, I know you love analogies. This is analogous in that way. This helps people to see, what it is you really, when you're asking for something, be aware of what you're asking for. You mentioned education earlier. I mentioned education, and and I know Nicole, being in the school system, certainly can speak to it better than I could. We talked about education, right? And we talked about racism and race and what do we learn in school about, African Americans, but there's also a large absence, a large gap, right? I have boys, I have children. I have a 19-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 12-year-old, all sons. And I can't tell you a single lesson that they've gotten about the Indian community, about Muslims, or about Russians, or about, different, or Irish, or German, or other Americans who got here, other than the boats came over and the Civil War and all of that sort of thing. But the point is, there is an education that has to be, I think, evolved, and it opens up when you actually recognize that this is a world that's supposed to be a connected world at this point, at 2020, more than it ever has been in the past. Vic, you're growing up in this time frame. You're a young adult in this time frame where the world is interconnected. Our message right now can be being watched in other countries because it's being broadcast in a public space.
Yeah.
So
just to kind of go from what Jason is saying, and I kind of want to backtrack to Don and Eric as well, as kind of what you guys were talking about before, even in the sports world, and just to bring it to light for our viewers so they see this, right? So you guys talked about your experiences with racism, right? Often in the Black community, our first experience with racism is an emotional one versus an educational one. My first experience with racism stemmed from a negative feeling that I felt from an external factor that was introduced, rather than having the ability to go educate myself and then make a decision on what it is that I'm going to think, believe, or feel, right? At a very young age, I was having to look in the mirror and have very serious conversations, right? Just to show, like, even if this is your experience and this is our experience, we've come to a stage in life where it isn't enough just to not see color or to kind of feel like, this, I haven't really seen this, or this is not the way I am. Because although, like, I love Don, anybody who feels that way that doesn't see it, the thing is, racism has been so strategically intentional that to reverse racism, we are asking our white allies or our other allies of other races to be intentional with their anti-racism, right? And I talked to someone recently that said, during this whole time period, I feel like, I'm always having to prove to people that I'm not racist, right? Let's unpack that. As a Black man or a Black female in this country, I've had to prove every day that I'm not a threat in some form or fashion, right? For people to take me serious, I have to go to Berkeley. I have to get a degree. I have to get further degrees, right? And the individual will look at me and their first thought is not what have I achieved, right? To give a very transparent story, right? In a master's program, one of our first kind of weeks, or one of our first classes we were in, grades came out after, and, I did really well, X, Y, and Z. And I had a fellow white classmate of mine lean over to me and say, wow, like, I'm surprised that you did so well in this class. Like, if I thought anybody here was going to struggle, I thought it would be you, right? And this is in a master's program where I was one of the only other people in the class that has a Berkeley degree, right? That's the #1 public school in the world, right? So another individual who even up until that point hadn't achieved anything or even 1/10 of what I had achieved felt that it was okay to lean over to me and say that. And I didn't get angry because I understand where it comes from, that implicit bias and that ignorance. Even for your experience as a team, right? Like, you've been on team sports and all this and that. what you guys have recanted as your experience being on a team sport is a different emotion from when I had to experience, and that alone lets you know there's inequality, right? You talk about it, think about it. Growing up, we played little league, all that football, right? Even at the school that I was at, where everyone was pretty much 85, 95% black, the one of the three white people that I just mentioned to you guys earlier ended up being the quarterback of our 7th and 8th grade team. This kid didn't go on to go to college and play football, really do anything athletically, not to say he's not a great person, right? Athletically in any sense, but he was awarded that position because there is this system of racism, even in sports, where it's like those particular positions, the quarterback, at one point, even in basketball back in the day and even in baseball, the important positions, the positions of leadership have always been looked at in sport as an exclusively white position. And you even see that in football. So my experience growing up with Little League, we're all friends, we're good, right? It's kumbaya. I got to learn things about a lot of different other people, but at the same time, I was still experiencing these racial differences, right? And having the emotion with these racial differences. I went on to have a great athletic career in middle school and high school, right? But even in the next high school I went to, right? There was a white individual who played the position that I wanted to play, who was a senior. Although I was better than him, I pretty much sat on the bench for a year while he just went off to college regularly and then got an opportunity to play. And I came in as a 5-star recruit who played as a freshman on varsity at the prior school, right? But a lot of colleges and a lot of individuals didn't look at that as that I had really done anything because I wasn't at a white school that also happens because of the system to be a school that has way more resources, right? We had the same number of people. This school that I went to was a 5A school, and this one was a 3A school. And in Texas, they define school size by how many people are there, right? But because this was so underfunded, even though we had the same amount of students at school A, it still was a 3A, considered a smaller school because school B got way more resources, right? And so in understanding that, what we're saying is there's a lot of individuals who come across and say, oh, I shouldn't feel like I have to prove I'm not racist, I don't see color. We have come in a stage in society where that isn't necessarily good enough anymore because we have had a lot of individuals be strategic with their racism against us. And so although you may not have had those experiences, right, and I'll use this analogy that I used earlier for the viewers to get it. Think of sharks, right, or any animal you're afraid of. A shark has not once killed any of my family members, has not done anything to me. I've never really seen a shark myself, right? But deep down, the emotion I have when someone says a shark, or if I go to the beach and someone says shark, is a negative one. Why is that, right? Because that's an implicit thought. It's because everything that I've seen in the media up into my life has told me or shown me that sharks are probably not a good thing to be around. Sharks are threatening. Sharks are dangerous, right? And in that sense, and if you look at some of the kids now who love, baby shark, whatever, the thing is, right? They love sharks, right? Because that's what they've been shown, right? So humans are innately ignorant, and I'll keep saying that. And what I mean by that is we're not born with a set of beliefs or really even knowing how to handle anything, right? We're not like other species where we're born and we immediately within 2 days know how to feed ourselves, know how to use the bathroom, know how to do all those other things. Humans, we have to be very intentional with our words and what we say. And so to say now, oh, I don't necessarily see color, I haven't, a lot of people miss there, and that's where a lot of the misinformation is, because of course you haven't seen it because of the position that you are in, right? And so just think of yourself. Why is it that you've ever felt this way about an alligator or shark or whatever? Because it's the media. It's the same way with African Americans, but in reverse. You have been taught and pushed through implicit ways, through images of TV. People think the system is just cops, police, X, Y, and Z, whatever, right? They think it's the judges, the government, politics. The system is down to the emotional level, thought, right? And so looking at it, you have to be able to take a step back and say, what are those images that I've continued to see throughout my life, right? You always see in TV, right? And just like Jason touched on, right? People only think of African Americans when they think of their African American they love or think it's great. It's always has to be an entertainer, a rapper, an athlete, right? They never think, oh, the most powerful African American who's a lawyer, right? A lot of people are looked at in the Black community as only being successful if they go on to become an athlete. And I can speak to that myself. as being someone who was walking that line and receiving the fake love or the love that's coming from an angle, right? And then for football to end for me, I was able to really see who was there for me and who was just, a fan, right? So a lot of individuals, and I had people who were fans of me when I was a player in high school, whatever, that when some political things or whatever happened and I had an opinion about it, you hear this thing of, shut up and dribble X, Y, and Z, right? And that happens on all levels. So when we're saying that it's not okay to just say, oh, we don't really see color, it's not just to bash anyone or to bring anyone down. It's just to speak and try to educate those who have not had that same experience to see, what the reality really is. And now you have to be very vocal in your stance. As tired as you are of this past 3 or 4 weeks that people have to really engage with it, for someone to say, oh, I'm kind of so tired of having to prove that I'm anti-racist. Imagine I've lived till 24 having to prove to people over and over my worth and getting pieces of paper to do so. Like, my level of intelligence or potential didn't increase because I graduated from Berkeley or I went to a white high school for my last 3 years. I was the same person, and I've gotten to this point in my life where I want people to see that I'm not worthy just because I have X, Y, and Z, right? I'm worthy as I come. I'm worthy walking in the door before I have these accolades, before I was an athlete, before I, graduated from college, right? Before I did any of these things. And I've even experienced it now with the kind of master school experience, is I want to get to a point where it's like, you're able to walk through the door, as a little league player and just enjoy it, right? You're able to, whatever, it's cool. Like, we're all kumbaya, but we're walking in the door with such a different experience. And I just want to kind of hit that hammer on the nail with that and let our viewers know that's kind of my perspective and a lot of people's perspective on it, right? I don't want to speak for everyone, but
it's great, and I'm gonna ask you, Jason, shortly, like in terms of answering. Go back to the initial question, right? So you're bringing up some important points. You're calling out Don in a good way. You're calling out me in a good way that we totally should have a back and forth about, but I'll use Don's example, saying like, I don't see color or something like that, right? At a time like now or at a time ever, right? And whether that's the right thing to do, whether that's the wrong thing to do. So my question for Vic, for Nicole, for Jason,
Eric,
is
if I can just kind of like jump in on this too.
Yeah.
I think giving our backgrounds and telling about our backgrounds just shows that nobody's seeing anything through the same lens or the same perspective.
Exactly, 100%.
And
right.
I think that, kind of we need to have a conversation, as we said before, right? We need to find those individuals. And going back to Jason's chart, I've always seen those first two parts, but never saw that last part with the chain link fence. And that's something too. It's not about, we've been doing this for 400 years, and it's like not that tit for tat, but those advocates that sort of want to do right and want to do help, right? How do we break those barriers, not attack each other and try to bring each other down? So, I think, again, just going through perspective, back to high school, right? Pretty even, like black and white for us. 3 out of the 4 years I was in high school, we had a black quarterback, and the white guy sucked, but he was what we were left with senior year. I led the county in receiving. I would have done even better if I had the other quarterbacks. But again, like literally everybody sees things through a different lens. And I acknowledged before is that I'm not going to pretend to know what you've been through or what you haven't been through. But what I can do is try to raise my kids to be the best people that they can be. And and to fight for what's right and to do what's right, and how do I teach them? It's by setting the right example, and what can I offer, and what can I do, and what can I say, when I can say it, when I can do it. And it's not about making other people uncomfortable or like I said, that tit for tat. It's how do we sort of collectively find the good people that can break those barriers down that Jason's thing sort of illustrated. And I don't have an answer. I'm kind of going through it, but
the answer is that we're talking through it,
right? But like just like the way that you grow up and the way that you're taught, and Vic, you said it right. Everything is learned, and so you need to pass that on. You being everybody, right? Me, I need to pass that on to the next generation a little better than my parents even did for me, and keep that cycle going, and then try to affect those that are around us. I'm oversimplifying it and not doing it any justice. But again, I think that we need to find more good and work towards better good together, um, and pass that on generationally.
And what you're doing right now, Don, just to touch on it, and so everyone knows what Don is doing right now, and I wasn't saying that, using that example to attack Don.
No.
Don is one of the best things that he can, right? He's listening. He's educating himself, because truthfully, you go back 400, 500 years, at that point, it would have been good enough to not see color, right? That's how utopian, that's what it should have been in the beginning. But why we kind of speak to that notion is because what we're saying is, for so many years, even the individuals who didn't really pick a side that were white, not really racist or not really here, they were kind of just bystanders, right? And we've kind of come into society at a point where we need those individuals who are white that can stand up and can be there as well, to be our allies. And so, yes, it would have been, if nobody ever saw color, that's ideal. Like, racism is the thing that ruined that idea, right? And so what we're trying to say when we tell an individual to kind of unpack when they're saying that is basically saying, hey, although that's great, and in practice that's what we would want, that's just not how life is. So we need you to come over here and push for us to gain that in life at one point, right? It doesn't make you racist because you say you don't see color. It doesn't make you any of those things. What it's saying is, I grew up a particular way, and this is my perspective, right? And the best thing that you can do is come forward, be honest, tell us you're discomfortable, tell us you're uncomfortable, tell us that you want to learn, that you need to be educated, and we'll always be there to have that open conversation, right? It's what stops it sometimes is when people openly take up the other side, right? And we need to do a better job as humans to the individuals like Don or like Eric who have grown up a certain way. Here's the thing, you can't control the way you grew up. Right. You can't control what your parents taught you. Again, you're innately born ignorant. You can't literally go back to one and say, let me do this right for myself. We're having these conversations so in generation of generation, we can improve and fix what's been going on for 400, 500 years, right? And so when we speak to that notion, it's simply saying, okay, like, that's great, that's utopian, but we need you to start thinking of what can we do right now to really fix this, because just saying like, this, I don't see that, it's not good enough. And I liken the example, think if the rest of the world looked at what happened in Germany with the Nazis, right, and the prosecution of Jews, if the rest of the world said, you know what, we don't really see that, or we don't really see Jews being killed here in America, so we're going to stay out of it, Jews would have been wiped off this planet, right? And so it wasn't enough to just be like, I don't believe that, but to continue let them doing it, someone had to stand up and stop it, and right? So that's kind of what we're asking out of allies, is just take that next step.
So what's difficult for Don and I, and we're representative right now, and I'm being very clear in that, of a white community, right? So I don't think I'm speaking on behalf of Don and I alone. I think I'm speaking on behalf of white people right now.
Look, I can only speak on behalf of myself, and I'm not. No, and I mean that. Like, it's serious.
Okay, that's fair. But Don, but we have friends who ask us questions, and we're people who do create thought-leading conversations, and we have friends that. So what I'm saying is, in what we're sharing here, it's a combination of what we ourselves have experienced or what our friends are saying they're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
And so, Vic, when we were doing the preparation call, you were saying it warms your heart when you see out in protesting that it's not just all black people protesting, that you see white people out there, you see people of different color out there protesting. So my question would be, because here's what's difficult for me, I'll be honest. I'll go on social media and I'll see some of my black friends, some that I'm close with and I can talk to and ask directly, some that I haven't spoken with in a while, so it's a little bit uncomfortable bringing up right now. And on their feeds, it'll be like, hey, white people, I don't need you asking me these questions right now. Or I don't need you to say this to me to make me feel better about things right now, right? And I'm just saying, like, what I'm reading, okay? So what I want to know is, like, as a white guy, as white people who are on this chat and are listening, right? As it comes to thinking about ourselves as wanting to be allies, thinking about ourselves as wanting to be people who can help move the conversation forward, outside of what we're doing right here, which is having the conversation, right? We said that that's a big piece of it, but in two ways, I'll ask you, Nicole and Jason, that is one, as it pertains to a white friend who's talking to you offline, just individually having a conversation with you. what do you want to hear from your white friends right now? Okay. And then publicly, when you see white people trying to be that ally, what do you want to see from them? Right? Because I go back to the conversation, like it feels like we're tapping a little bit around this. It's like we have the family member or the friend whose family member passed away. You want to say something, but you're not exactly sure what to say. You want to be supportive, but you're not exactly sure what's considered to be supportive. So guide us. I mean, you gave Don a lot of credit for listening. I think you got a lot of people on here who are listening. And in listening, what can we do? That's what we want to hear.
I can say this, right? We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? That's a normal saying. But as an individual, if I'm speaking to your white individual, listen 3 times as much as you speak. As you're walking into the conversation, you have to intentionally leave all the implicit biases and the things that you don't even understand that you're thinking about and just hear us, right? You got to be able to hear us and hear what we're saying and then engage with the conversation that way. What happens a lot of times when we start the conversation, and here's three things that a lot of individuals, white individuals like to hide their, ignorance or racism or implicit biases behind, right? And you see it, right? There's religion, there's nationalism, one's for love for one's nation, right? And there's also kind of this whole idea of I have X amount of black friends, right? These people are my black friends. I can't be racist. I'm not X, Y, and Z. And so the biggest thing that you have to do is understand that as an individual, as a human, you have not been 100% educated, right? And even us as African Americans, I took African American courses in college and had to learn more after I've already experienced emotionally with racism, right? And so one of the biggest things that you can do is open your ears and listen, but listen not to respond, listen to learn, listen to gain information. And one thing that everyone needs to make okay is be very okay with changing your opinion after you've learned new information. What happens a lot of the times and why the yelling start is that I can give an individual information that's just facts. But because for however many years they've been trained mentally to think a certain way, they'll refute all those facts or what's really out there and stick to their guns. This is not one of those things where it's LeBron versus Jordan. And I'm just going to say, regardless of statistics, I love Jordan because I grew up watching him, right? That's what happens with a lot of even the Kobe LeBron arguments. That's what a lot of that is. This is not one of those spaces. You have to listen. You have to be okay. And you have to be ready to look in the mirror and have that conversation. And truthfully, if you're not uncomfortable when you have these talks, or you're not uncomfortable when you're going out trying to teach yourself these things, you're not doing it right. And so what we ask for is for you to put yourself in that uncomfortable space. Have those hard conversations at home. Learn, teach yourself, and listen to us. That's the biggest thing that you can do. And that's why all the conversations we have with Don, he's been soaking up and trying to learn so much. And that's all we ask, because no matter what, every African American on this call can say, no matter what you do, you will never 100% understand. It's just almost, the experience is too much. There's too much generational trauma. There's too much just generational systematic oppression for you to ever on the nail understand. And if any individuals coming to you saying, you need to understand fully, like they're also misled, right? And so we want empathy. We want you to be able to be honest and say, have this uncomfortable feeling and talk to us. And that's really what it boils down to. Like, there's nothing that any of you are going to do right in this second to fix everything. But how we fix it is that if now you become more educated and you learn and you really listen and you're able to form new opinions and go engage with real history and new facts, you're going to be better suited to bring your kids into this world and really educate them properly and give them the opportunity to see the world as it should be.
So great answer there in terms of more ears than mouths. Nicole, I want to bring you back in and kind of take what Vic said and get your opinion on it. I think part of that, a little bit what's difficult for a white person, Vic, is that unless you proactively go to your black friends and say, educate me, okay, which is one possibility. You fear when you say educate me, is my black friend going to say, you know what we're going through right now? I don't have the time to educate you. You need to educate yourself. And that might be an okay answer, but that's a possibility of something we fear. So I'm going to throw it to Nicole right now. The other fear that we have, Vic, is if it becomes about us educating ourselves and we don't speak up. Don did this with his company. He held back a little bit about putting some public major statements out there. It can be, we're fearful that that's going to be interpreted by the Black community as we don't care because we're not proactively going out in there and saying things. So Nicole, if you could chime in on both of those, because Vic is saying listening is so important, but how do we ask the questions so that we can learn? And then if we're a little bit more quiet and trying to listen, do you interpret that as we're just going along for the ride and we're okay with things?
So I've had a few of my white friends reach out to me since everything has happened, and they just asked me, am I okay? And to me, that was enough. I don't expect every individual to be this revolutionary, diehard political person or whatever. But what I do want is compassion and empathy, for sure, because I had a couple of different meetings where I was saying, just put yourself in our shoes and put yourself in a place where George Floyd was your brother or your father. You wouldn't want people to be silent, because being silent really causes complacency, and it causes us to get to where we are right now. And in terms of not seeing color, Don, I know you have a good heart, and I know that you don't mean anything by it, but we need people to see our color, because we need people to recognize our differences, because our differences are what makes us. Our differences is what makes us, honestly, is what's causing all of the confusion and everything that's going on right now. So just to say that you're blind, a lot of people take it, or I don't see color, a lot of people take it as you don't see everything that's happening to us. And I've struggled, and I know many of Black people have struggled a lot with, you're not seeing it, so nothing's changing. Like, we don't hold most of the positions of power, so we need you to see the color, and we need you to get involved and speak to your friends, speak to your lawyer friends, whoever it may be, your politician friends, so you can affect change on a policy level. And if you have white friends, if you know them, you truly know their heart, I don't think them asking questions is anything wrong with that. I think what's wrong with it is when you get offensive, because, and I understand people being offensive because it's a really sensitive subject, but if your friends are reaching out to you and asking questions, just listen and understand that they're coming from a place of not knowing. Like Vic said, white people have never been in our shoes. So I would take it as a compliment if one of my friends asked me, what can I do from here, or whatever the case may be. I think it's really important also that we support Black businesses. Black businesses we don't get the funds and everything invested in us as white businesses do, which keeps us down. And it's more about just unity, just being here for us and not wanting to, really express that white guilt. I think a lot of times what happens is white people don't talk about it because they feel a certain level of guilt because white people held slaves. We're not saying that you held the slaves. We're just asking you to really admit that your race played a part of it. And now what can we do to move on from here? What can we do to break all of these laws and everything that are in place to keep us down and to keep us oppressed? And having these conversations like this, and I really appreciate it, it's the start. Because once we realize that it's okay to be uncomfortable in these situations, we'll start to talk about it more, and we'll start to affect change. And we can't affect that change without allies. It's just not enough of us, and we're not in enough power positions. And maybe I'm just a little different, but I don't get offended at a lot of different things. It's just because I know people are coming from a good heart. They're coming from a place where they're trying to be supportive. But if you are just so offensive, you'll take whatever that person says and you'll just run with it and say that they're racist. And honestly, a lot of white people in this country aren't racist. I mean, you do have that pack that are diehard racists and white supremacists and everything. But the other white people are just from a place of not knowing, because we don't get educated in school about these different things. And if you don't go out and do your own education, you don't know about how, we're continually being oppressed. A lot of white people have said, I don't see so much racism now until recently with the George Floyd thing. And us as Black people are like, what? You don't see racism? How is that? Like every other month I get pulled over for just driving while Black. But you're not experiencing these things. So it's a level of ignorance that's there. And I think how we could teach our kids and how we could just get rid of racism altogether is to really immerse yourself into our culture, learn about our culture, read your kids' books with Black heroes, and read your kid books with just Black figures. Look at Black movies and Black documentaries and things of that sort, because we're tired of being invisible. And when you say you don't see that color, that's how we feel. So just acknowledge us, acknowledge that we are humans just like the rest of everyone else, and we're no different from anyone else. It's just the differences is the stereotypes that have been painted around us. We're painted to be aggressive. We're painted to be thugs and gigolos and whores and all of these things. And that's just not the case. Most Black people, a majority of Black people, are just normal people like the rest of us. But when white people meet these normal people, these normal successful people, they think that we're the outlier. And that's not the case. There's tons of Black successful people, but what gets highlighted all the time is all of the negative stuff.
I think the microcosm, as we go to Jason, of the comment.
Well, Eric, let me just.
Don's I'm gonna defend you a little bit in a good way. The whole like I don't see colors.
But I never said that. Like that's not what I said. What I said, or what I meant, I should say, is that I grew up right when my impressionable years, it was just friends on a schoolyard. And, to the point of being that ally and being that person and talking to those people, and I think Vic can attest the last 2 weeks, while everybody's posting a black box, before I did that, the days before, I'm picking up the phone and, Nicole, it wasn't just how are you doing? It is how are you doing? But then it was, how are you doing? What do you need from me? What can I do to help you, right? What can I do? And Vic kind of knew this after the fact, I think, when we had like a broader conversation about it, but I want to just say that, like, it wasn't like I said, I don't see race. It was kind of like the opposite. I personally don't let that affect the way I interface with people,
and I totally get that. But you just have to understand, we've heard that so much.
Right.
Right, but I didn't say that.
Yeah. It's not like
because even, and it sort of like blurs and whitewashes everything that we're working for.
Absolutely agree with you.
Right. Because even when we say Black Lives Matter, when a white person comes back and say, well, all lives matter, but it's like, duh, we know that all lives matter, but do you know that our life matters?
That's why I was saying, like Don's comment is a microcosm, and the misunderstanding, I don't mean this in a bad way.
No, Don's comment again. I'm going to go back and review the tape. Maybe I misspoke.
No. Look, Don, you came at it.
Again, personal experience. You asked for like how we were brought up. That was my neighborhood.
Right.
That was my high school.
But Don, in fairness, your vantage point where you grew up, when you say I grew up where there was no difference, these are my teammates, that's your endearing way of saying that, right? That comes from growing up where you specifically in your mind didn't see that, right? And what your hope would be is take away campaigns, take away change that needs to happen. If you could flip a switch, you would love it for every person on this world, even though Nicole's saying we do need to see the color so that change can happen, is we'd love to get to a point where regardless of what the pigment of someone's skin is, we see people as people. Nicole's coming at it from the vantage point of, hey, if we continue to hear that term, not from you, Don, from anyone in society that's a white person, what that does is it discounts the change that we're trying to make happen, because then people don't see the differences and then they don't go to bat for those differences and they don't have our back on those differences and they're just trying to gloss over it.
Yeah.
So that's the fascinating microcosm of this whole thing, I think, in society that's happening right now. We could be saying the same things just in different ways, and the way we internalize them, it actually sounds different to each of us.
Nicole said something earlier about the policies that are meant to keep the African American communities, right, beholden to the social welfare system, right, which I think could be a whole nother conversation. But I think, and then coming full circle to about, right, how do we talk to the people in power to effectively make the changes, right? And I said earlier, right, awareness has to be at a pretty close to an all-time high right now. And then who are those people in the positions of power that we need to approach to change the system? Going back to these welfare systems, right? And sort of the politics of it all. And who are the influencers that have been embedded in these communities for so long that could make change, that haven't made change, and how do we reach them to get to that next level? So I think there's something she said earlier, I think, like, kind of sparked something in me, and then bringing it back to the decision makers and the influencers. There is that political system that I don't think we should touch on because we're almost an hour and a half in right now. But yeah, there's a lot to it, even than just the interpersonal relationships that we have with our neighbors and our acquaintances.
But we have to start with the communication amongst us, right? And I'll go to Jason because he hasn't spoken in a while. As we then try to start to round it down. Is Jason, like, you know, we've talked about it just as friends, and it's something that Nicole just brought up. And she brought up Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter and stuff like that. I want to believe, and the reason why we're having these conversations is that Nicole talks about the majority of people, and yes, there are outliers that live in this white supremacist world, and there's outliers who live in another world. But the majority of people, I want to believe, have good intentions and want to see there be that fence taken away in that third picture like you showed. The challenge is when you grow up from different backgrounds, the way in which you internalize a message, okay, the way you internalize it might not be the way that the person who created the message intended the message to be understood. And so you've got campaigns and you've got names to those campaigns and you've got ways that we're going around and we're doing protests and we're doing marches. And if you could touch just a little bit, Jason, on, like, just because it might emotionally set a charge in you in a certain way, the only way around those charges is to not continue to go on social media and say your campaign louder than that person's campaign who says it's louder than their campaign, or do it on the streets to each other back and forth. But it's to actually have these conversations so you can understand each other, why those emotional charges come from those terms that we're using.
So for me, personally, one of the things that is a foundational.
Jason, I can't hear you.
Yeah, you got very low.
You're kind of low.
Maybe it's the microphone. Hold on. I'll just unplug the headset. You guys hear me better now?
Yeah.
All right. So what I was saying is, for me, a foundational piece of how I live my life, right, is the teachings of Eckhart Tolle, who is a spiritual teacher, has written The Power of Now and The New Earth and Stillness Speaks and a lot of other very, very powerful books. And one of the baseline, focuses of his teachings is that you are the only person responsible for your state of consciousness, right? You are. So each of us has our own responsibility and accountability. And Eric, you talked about, like, how these different campaigns, everybody gets kind of, built into kind of a category. Everybody chooses a lane. Everybody wants to, and per our pre-call, everybody looks for some place that they feel like they fit in, that they belong, that they can be accepted for who they are. And Eckhart's teachings really talk about that as means of identity. We form identities, and some identities are formed for us. We have gender identity, race identity, class identity, all these different kind of, whether are we an athlete, are we a nerd, are we all these different classifications. Are we join fraternities and sororities and groups and organizations? And everybody gets lodged into their own kind of lane. The truth is this: it's not so complicated. The most basic thing is it goes back to that old quote that says, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And so I think Martin Luther King then addressed that when he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So the worst thing that we can do is say nothing at all and do nothing at all. Just sit on our hands and act like it's not happening. And it is happening. Whether it's in Pittsburgh, I believe it was, when someone went into the Jewish temple, shot down I think murdered 11 people.
12 people, yeah.
Right. That is an injustice. And it hurts. But we have to recognize the pain and face it.
It's powerful, man. I mean, to see the emotions, the raw emotions that come from that, and I want to say, for Jason, for everyone who's been a part of this, it's only been an hour and a half, and the stuff that we've touched on, we're really just scratching the surface, right? Jason and Nicole, that we're part of a group that we put together that we want to have these conversations from an ongoing perspective. We're going to have another one on Thursday. We're going to keep them going because, these layers are layers that we need to keep peeling away from this. And the only way these layers keep getting peeled away is by us continuing to have these conversations this way, by the raw emotions coming out the way they did with you, Jason, by the slight conflict in terms of back and forth that we have. And I said this when we were doing the pre-call, and hopefully everyone who's listened to this agrees with what they've seen here is the people that we want to invite to these calls, the people that need to engage in these conversations, they can have very strong opinions. They can have a certain specific way of looking at things, but the only way we move forward is, that's why it's ending on a really great note, the way that Jason just described this, is if we're so dug in our heels in our way of thinking that it's only about the way that we see the world, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to get anywhere. The way that we get places is we could be competitive people, we could be stubborn people, we could be hard-driven people, but we have to be people who can have difficult conversations and realize that part of having those conversations and moving forward is understanding the different vantage points that so many different people come from and how life situations impact us in so many different ways. And so, I know we've gone an hour and a half here, which is awesome. And I'm sure the five of us could probably stay on forever, which is awesome. But for the purposes of everyone who's watching, we'll start to bring it to a close now. But wanted to thank everyone who certainly tuned in to listen. We're going to make these available through video as well. Nicole and Jason, as we continue to have these conversations, Vic, Don, and I would love to have you guys back and dive even deeper into these topics. And you've seen the list of about 13 questions, which is really 30 questions that I put together. Of again, we just really started baseline right now. There's so many more things we got to dive into. So this is the beginning, guys, and this emotion, this raw way that we're going into it, is what's going to allow us to keep peeling those layers away. So Jason, Nicole, Vic, Don, really thank you. Can't wait for us to do it again on Thursday. Can't wait for us to all keep talking about it. Please send any of us who are watching, who know us, direct messages and give us feedback about topics you'd like to see us discuss, and we'll keep this conversation going. So again, on behalf of everyone, thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.